Elliot pressed his back against the cool, carved surface of the grand oak doors, his heart hammering against his rib cage like a frantic drumbeat. The faint murmur of whispered conversation seeped through the heavy wood, blending with the melodic strains of the wedding march. Inside, the air buzzed with excitement, every guest oblivious to the storm brewing just outside. Elliot tightened his grip on the phone, its smooth surface grounding him as his mind raced. His palms were damp, his fingers trembling, not just from fear, but from the weight of what he was about to do. Through the narrow crack between the double doors, Elliot caught a glimpse of the scene unfolding inside. Rows of polished pews were filled with well-dressed guests, all leaning forward in quiet anticipation. White lilies adorned every corner, their sweet scent almost palpable, even from his hiding spot. The faint glow of candlelight reflected off Vanessa's diamond-studded gown as she stood before his father, her expression a perfect mask of love and devotion. Elliot clenched his jaw. To anyone else, Vanessa looked like the epitome of grace, her every movement calculated to charm. But to Elliot, her poise was nothing more than a carefully rehearsed act. He had spent weeks gathering evidence, piecing together the puzzle that would shatter this illusion. Yet, as confident as he was about her lies, standing on the brink of exposing her felt like stepping off a cliff. Deep breath, he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible over the muffled laughter of the crowd, but his breath hitched as his gaze shifted to his dad. Robert stood tall and proud at the altar, though there was a slight tension in his posture that only someone who truly knew him could notice. Elliot had always admired his father's ability to stay composed, but today, even through the crack of the door, he could see the faint tremor in Robert's hands as he adjusted his tie. Elliot's stomach twisted. There was a time when he thought his dad was invincible, someone who could solve anything with a warm smile and a steady hand. But that image had cracked along with their family. Since the divorce, Robert had been chasing something, or maybe someone, to fill the void. Elliot couldn't blame him for wanting to be happy, but he couldn't ignore the knot in his chest that tightened every time Vanessa's name was mentioned. He took a step back, leaning against the door again as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. His mom's words echoed in his mind. Do what you think is right. She hadn't told him to stop the wedding. She hadn't even told him to act. But the unspoken trust in her voice had been enough. Elliot wasn't just doing this for his dad. He was doing it for their family, for the truth, for the little part of himself that still hoped things could get better. The faint sound of the officiant's voice jolted him back to reality. We are gathered here today. The ceremony had begun. Elliot's pulse quickened as he glanced down at his phone. The screen lit up, revealing the folder of evidence he'd meticulously compiled. Photos of Vanessa with other men, text messages filled with veiled threats, and screenshots of her aliases and legal troubles stared back at him. He had everything he needed, yet his fingers hovered uncertainly over the device. What if no one believed him? What if his dad hated him for ruining this moment? But then he remembered that night, just a week ago, when he'd overheard Vanessa's phone call. Her voice had been cold, her words sharper than he'd ever heard before. She'd mentioned debts, a deal, and a man named Mark. It wasn't the voice of someone in love. It was the voice of someone calculating her next move. He never heard from her again, but for the first time, amazingly, the voice of a man in pain, never resisting influence. He had been completely without power to resist. The memory steeled his resolve. He couldn't let his dad walk into this blind. The doors suddenly creaked, and Elliot froze. A small girl in a frilly pink dress peeked out, her wide eyes locking onto him. She tilted her head curiously, her fingers clutching the handle of a flower basket. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice soft but curious. Elliot forced a smile. "Just thinking," he whispered. "Don't tell anyone, okay?" The girl frowned but nodded, retreating back inside. The door shut softly, and Elliot exhaled, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. Inside, the officiant continued, his words growing louder, more deliberate. Elliot could tell they were nearing the critical moment. The question everyone knew was coming. He thought of all the nights he'd stayed up researching, of all the times he'd wanted to quit but didn't. He thought of his mom's encouragement, his dad's blind trust, and the uneasy feeling that had gnawed at him since Vanessa first appeared. Most of all, he thought of the truth he now held in his hands, a truth that could destroy his father's dreams but save him from something far worse. With a final, steadying breath, Elliot pushed open the door just enough to slip inside. He stood at the back of the church, unnoticed for now as the ceremony carried on. But his presence felt like a storm cloud gathering over a sunny day, ready to unleash chaos at any moment. And as the officiant finally asked, "If anyone here objects to this union, speak now or forever hold your peace," Elliot stepped forward, his voice steady despite the whirlwind inside him. "I do." Elliot remembered the day his dad left like it had been etched in slow motion. The slam of the door, the muffled sobs from his mom's room, and the deafening silence that followed. All of it had imprinted itself in his mind. Their once lively home, with its warm light and familiar sounds of laughter, had turned into a house filled with unanswered questions. At 10 years old, Elliot didn't fully understand the reasons behind his parents' separation, but he couldn't escape the feeling that something was being kept from him. By slowly glowing sections cutting the fog apart in a way no photograph or video could ever be. In the months that followed, Claire tried her best to shield him from the uglier truths. She never badmouthed Robert, even when her eyes betrayed her hurt. She poured herself into making their small new apartment feel like home, filling the walls with old photos and cheerful decorations. But Elliot couldn't help noticing how tired she always looked, or how she flinched whenever his dad's name came up. Robert, on the other hand, seemed almost untouched. Every other weekend, Elliot would go to his dad's townhouse, a sleek, modern place that felt like a stranger's house. Robert would smile and ask him about school, trying to keep things light, but Elliot sensed the awkwardness beneath it. It was as if Robert didn't know how to act around him anymore. Or maybe he didn't know what to say. The man who had once felt like a superhero now seemed smaller, more distant. Then Vanessa appeared. It started with mentions of her name in casual conversation. "Vanessa and I went to that new restaurant," Robert would say, or "Vanessa suggested I try this wine." Elliot hadn't paid much attention at first, dismissing her as just another person in his dad's life. But then Robert introduced her to him. Too soon as far as Elliot was concerned. She had swept into their Saturday lunch date at the diner, her perfume heavy and her smile perfect, and immediately taken over the conversation. Vanessa was everything Claire wasn't. Glamorous, outgoing, and effortlessly charming. She had this way of talking to Robert, of touching his arm and laughing at his jokes, that made Elliot's stomach churn. She didn't seem fake exactly, but there was something about her that felt off. It wasn't just that she wasn't his mom. It was the way she looked at him, like he was a piece of furniture in her weight, or an obstacle she hadn't figured out how to navigate. Elliot tried to voice his feelings to Claire once, but she just smiled softly and said, "Your dad deserves to be happy, Elliot, and so do we." He could see the pain in her eyes, though. No matter how much she tried to hide it, Claire wasn't okay with Vanessa either. The engagement had been the tipping point. Robert announced it over dinner one weekend, beaming as he showed off the sparkling diamond ring he'd given Vanessa. "She's going to be your stepmom," he'd said, as if expecting Elliot to be excited. Elliot had barely been able to finish his meal. That night, he lay awake in his room, staring at the ceiling and replaying the moment over and over in his head. He felt a mix of anger and sadness that he couldn't put into words. How could his dad move on so easily? How could he replace their family with someone who didn't belong? And yet, it wasn't just the engagement that bothered him. It was Vanessa herself. There were moments when her charm slipped, moments when her smile didn't reach her eyes. Elliot couldn't explain why, but he felt certain she was hiding something. The next morning, as Claire poured him a bowl of cereal, she said quietly, "If something doesn't feel right, Elliot, trust your gut." Elliot said the last words with a sigh, his lips hanging open with sadness. It was all the encouragement he needed. He began paying closer attention, watching Vanessa whenever he saw her. At first, he wasn't sure what he was looking for. But the more he observed, the more cracks he noticed. A strange phone call she quickly ended when she noticed him listening. A comment about needing to tie up loose ends that made Robert laugh, but left Elliot uneasy. And then, the discovery that changed everything. A folder on her laptop, left open by mistake, filled with names and photos of people Elliot didn't recognize. That's when he knew Vanessa wasn't who she claimed to be, and if his dad wouldn't see it, Elliot would have to make him. Elliot couldn't deny that Vanessa had a way of commanding attention. From the moment she entered a room, she seemed to light it up with her sparkling smile and designer outfits. Everyone, Robert, his friends, even the neighbors, was drawn to her like moths to a flame. She'd perfected the art of charm, throwing compliments like confetti and making people feel like they were the center of her universe. At least for a moment. With Elliot, she took a different approach. Every visit to his dad's house seemed to come with some grand gesture. A new video game console one week, a rare collectible card the next. "I know how much you love this stuff," she'd say with a wink, placing the neatly wrapped gift in front of him. At first, Elliot wasn't sure how to feel about her generosity. The gifts were undeniably cool, and for a while, he wondered if maybe she was trying to win him over. But there was something in her tone, a hint of calculation, that made the whole act feel rehearsed. It wasn't just the gifts either. Vanessa had started asking pointed questions about his life, his routines, and even his mom. Outside, the Kamers examined their experiences with Emma, secured their passports, and made preparations for a more perceptive. "Your mom must be so busy with work these days," she'd say casually, her smile just a little too tight. Elliot didn't like the way she said "your mom," as if Claire were some distant stranger rather than the person who had held their family together. He began answering her questions with vague responses, unsure of her motives. Claire, on the other hand, saw right through Vanessa's act. One evening, after picking Elliot up from his dad's house, she broached the subject in the car. "Has Vanessa been spending a lot of time with you?" she asked, her voice careful, as if she didn't want to alarm him. Elliot shrugged. "She's around?" "Why?" Claire hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Just..." Elliot wanted to brush it off as bitterness, the lingering wounds of their divorce speaking louder than reason. But the more he thought about it, the more certain he became that Claire wasn't entirely wrong. They tied their shoes and stood to go. Elliot took Elliot's hand and pulled his alpang closed over his own before letting him lead her from the room. It wasn't just the way Vanessa inserted herself into every aspect of their lives. It was the way she seemed to subtly take control of things. Robert's schedule, for instance, had shifted dramatically since Vanessa moved in. Dinners with old friends were canceled, family routines were rearranged, and suddenly Vanessa was overseeing his finances. In the past 5 years, responsibilities in the home had undergone a far-reaching transformation. "She's just helping me stay organized," Robert explained once, brushing off Elliot's curiosity. "She's great with money." Elliot didn't buy it. He'd overheard a heated conversation between Robert and Vanessa a few weeks earlier. Something about missing funds and needing to cover tracks. His dad had laughed it off when Elliot asked about it, but the memory stuck with him. Vanessa's interest in Elliot's hobbies was another red flag. She'd spent hours researching his favorite games and shows, dropping references into casual conversation as if they were her own. At first it felt flattering, but over time it began to feel intrusive, almost like she was studying him. One day she surprised him with tickets to a gaming convention he'd been dying to attend. "I thought we could go together," she said brightly, her eyes scanning his face for a reaction. "Why?" he said. Elliot mumbled a thank you, but the gesture only deepened his unease. How did she even know about the convention? He hadn't mentioned it to anyone but his mom. Back at home, he told Claire about the tickets. She frowned, her brows knitting together. "She's trying too hard," she muttered. "Maybe she's just being nice," Elliot said, though he didn't fully believe it himself. Claire looked him in the eye. "Nice doesn't feel like this, Elliot. There's a difference between being generous and being manipulative. Pay attention." Her words stayed with him. The next time Vanessa offered a gift, he studied her closely. Her smile was wide, her tone cheerful. But there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Impatience, maybe, or expectation. It was as if she were waiting for him to react a certain way, to let his guard down. The turning point came when Claire stumbled across a strange detail. While researching something unrelated, she found Vanessa's name linked to a lawsuit from years ago. It wasn't much, just a brief mention in an obscure financial fraud case, but it was enough to raise her suspicions. "Elliot," Claire said one evening, her voice steady but urgent, "I need you to be extra careful. If anything seems strange, I want you to tell me immediately." Elliot nodded, his mind racing. He didn't know exactly what Vanessa was up to, but one thing was clear: she wasn't the perfect person she pretended to be, and now he had to figure out how to prove it. Elliot couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that made his thoughts feel louder than they were. As he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he heard it, the faint murmur of a voice. It was coming from downstairs, where Vanessa and his dad had gone after dinner. Only now, it was just her voice. Curiosity got the better of him. He slipped out of bed, careful not to let the old wooden floorboards creak, and crept toward the staircase. Her words grew clearer with each step. "No, Mark, I told you already," Vanessa hissed, her usual warmth replaced by a tone sharp enough to cut glass. "I'll have the money soon. He trusts me completely. The deal is almost done." Elliot froze, his heart pounding. Who was Mark? And what deal was she talking about? "I don't care how nervous you are," she continued, her voice low but fierce. "We've come too far for you to screw this up now. Just stick to the plan, and I'll take care of the rest." His palms went clammy as he crouched behind the banister, straining to hear every word. Vanessa's tone softened suddenly, almost like she'd remembered where she was. "Yes, of course. I've got everything under control. Trust me." The call ended, and the silence returned. Elliot's mind raced. Vanessa wasn't just suspicious, she was dangerous. The mention of money and trust sent alarm bells ringing in his head. Back in his room, he paced nervously. He thought about waking his dad and telling him everything. But what would he say? That Vanessa had a shady phone call with someone named Mark? It wasn't enough. His dad would just brush it off, like he always did when Elliot voiced his concerns about Vanessa. No, he needed proof. The next morning, while Vanessa was out running errands, Elliot began his investigation. He started with her phone, which she'd carelessly left charging on the kitchen counter. He felt a pang of guilt as he picked it up, but he shook it off. He wasn't doing this for himself. He was doing it for his dad. The phone was locked, of course. He stared at the screen, thinking about the dozens of times he'd seen her swipe her passcode. Slowly, he typed in the numbers. 4 taps later, the screen unlocked. Helpful? At 7:15. Window. Elliot quickly navigated to her call log, scrolling through the recent entries. There it was. Mark. The number had no last name, no photo, just a stark reminder of last night's conversation. He jotted it down on a scrap of paper, then moved on to her messages. His heart sank as he read the texts. Mark, are you sure the funds will transfer without a hitch? Vanessa, relax. I've done this before. He won't suspect a thing. Sarah. Another message caught his eye, one from a contact labeled Client. Client, once it's signed, I want immediate access, no delays. Vanessa. Don't worry, the paperwork's being processed. I'll make sure the transition is smooth. Transition. He heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway and panicked. Quickly, he locked the phone and placed it exactly where he'd found it, then bolted back upstairs. His heart raced as he replayed everything in his mind. Vanessa was involved in something big, something that involved his dad's money. But how could he prove it? Over the next few days, Elliot became a shadow. He listened more closely to Vanessa's conversations, watched her every move, and kept a mental record of anything suspicious. She was careful, but not careful enough. One evening, as they were sitting in the living room, Vanessa casually mentioned a business opportunity she'd been pursuing. It transformed into a present for me when I found the door fully open. It's just something small, she said, waving a manicured hand. An investment, really. I figured it couldn't hurt to diversify a bit. Robert smiled, oblivious. Well, as long as you know what you're doing. Elliot wanted to scream. How could his dad be so blind? Later that night, Elliot called his mom. He kept his voice low, not wanting anyone to overhear. Mom, I think you were right about Vanessa, he whispered. There was a pause. What happened? Claire's tone was sharp, the worry evident. Elliot told her everything, the phone call, the texts, the cryptic conversations. Elliot, you need to be careful, she said, her voice tight. If she's as dangerous as you think, you can't let her know you're onto her. I know, he said, gripping the phone tightly. But I can't just sit back and do nothing. Then you need to find real evidence, something undeniable. Her words stayed with him long after they hung up. He didn't know what Vanessa was planning, but one thing was clear. He had to stop her before it was too late. Elliot sat in his room, staring at the ceiling. His mom's words from the previous night echoed in his mind. You need to find real evidence. But where could he even begin? Vanessa was careful. She didn't leave traces, at least not obvious ones. He needed help, and he knew exactly who to call. Lucas, Elliot said into his phone. I need a favor, a big one. Lucas, his best friend since kindergarten, had an uncanny knack for tech and an insatiable curiosity that rivaled Elliot's. If anyone could help him uncover Vanessa's secrets, it was Lucas. All right, Lucas replied, his voice buzzing with intrigue. Tell me everything. Elliot explained everything he'd overheard, what he'd found on Vanessa's phone, and his growing suspicion that she was hiding something big. Lucas was silent for a moment. Then he said, Okay, this might take a while, but I'll see what I can dig up. Send me anything you've got. Names, numbers, whatever. That night, Lucas and Elliot huddled in Lucas's basement, their laptops glowing in the dim light. Lucas cracked his knuckles, ready to dive into what he called the deep dive. First step, social media, Lucas said. No one can resist posting their whole life online. Vanessa's profiles were as pristine as her smile. Pictures of luxurious vacations, chic outfits, and her glowing relationship with Robert. But Lucas wasn't fooled. People like her always have skeletons, he muttered. It's just a matter of finding the right closet. After an hour of searching, they hit their first clue. Lucas found an old photo of Vanessa, tagged by someone named Allison. But here's the catch. The caption read, "Can't believe Vanessa is going by Eva now. Classic move." "Eva?" Elliot asked, leaning in. "Yup," Lucas replied, smirking. "Looks like our girl has a habit of rebranding herself." Kessler settled against her father. They followed the digital trail, searching for Eva and other aliases Vanessa might have used. As they dug deeper, a troubling pattern emerged. Vanessa, or Eva, or whatever her real name was, had been involved in multiple relationships with wealthy men, and every single one ended with lawsuits, fraud allegations, or quiet settlements, both more ins and less. Whoa, Elliot breathed as Lucas pulled up yet another court document. "She's been sued 3 times? 4, if you count this one in Nevada," Lucas added, scrolling. "Oh, hell." Each case painted a similar picture. Vanessa swooping into a man's life, gaining his trust, and walking away with significant financial benefits. "It's like a playbook," Lucas said, his voice tinged with disgust. "Meet rich guy, fake perfect life, drain him dry, and disappear." But it didn't stop there. Lucas dug into public records and discovered a disturbing detail. Vanessa had changed her legal name 3 times over the past decade, each time after a major scandal. "What kind of person does this?" Elliot muttered, feeling a mix of anger and unease. "Someone who knows how to play the system," Lucas replied grimly. The final piece of the puzzle came when Lucas stumbled across an old blog post. It was written by a man named Greg, who claimed to have been one of Vanessa's former fiancés. In the post, he described how she'd manipulated him, drained his savings, and left him humiliated. Elliot's stomach turned as he read the words on the screen. "She'll make you believe she's the best thing that's ever happened to you. By the time you realize the truth, it's too late." "That's it," Elliot said, his voice firm. "We have enough. This wedding isn't just a mistake. It's a setup." Lucas nodded. "But how are you going to convince your dad? He's totally blinded by her." Elliot hesitated. That was the hardest part. His dad was so enamored with Vanessa that he barely listened to anything negative about her. But now, Elliot had something he didn't have before. Hard evidence. "We'll figure that out," Elliot said, gathering the screenshots and files they'd compiled. "But first, I need to make sure Vanessa doesn't see this coming." The weight of what they'd uncovered settled on Elliot's shoulders as he walked home. His dad was set to marry a woman who had a proven track record of ruining lives. If Elliot didn't stop this, his dad would be her next victim. The stakes had never been higher. Elliot stood in the kitchen, gripping the counter as his dad's words replayed in his mind. "You're just upset about the divorce." The sting of dismissal burned in his chest, but more than that, fear had begun to creep in. His dad was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, and no matter what Elliot said, Robert refused to listen. "Maybe I didn't explain it right," Elliot muttered to himself, pacing the small space. "Maybe I need to try again." He pulled up the screenshots on his phone, the aliases, the lawsuits, the damning blog post, and headed into the living room, where Robert sat flipping through the latest issue of a car magazine. He felt wild-eyed and full of hope when he saw her, and his mouth dropped open. The climax of the story had already come literally a day ago. He pulled up the screenshots on his phone. "Dad," Elliot began, his voice trembling with urgency. Robert looked up, his brow furrowed. "Elliot, not this again." "Just listen, okay? Please," Elliot pleaded, holding his phone up. "This isn't about the divorce. It's about Vanessa. She's not who you think she is." Robert sighed heavily and set the magazine down. "Son, I know this is hard for you, but Vanessa isn't the problem here. You're upset because things changed, and you're blaming her for it. Elliot's frustration boiled over. No, Dad. I'm upset because she's lying to you. Look at this. He shoved his phone forward, the screen displaying a court record tied to one of Vanessa's aliases. She's been sued for fraud multiple times. She changes her name to cover her tracks. Robert leaned back, crossing his arms. Where did you even get this? You've been digging into her personal life? Yes, because someone had to. Elliot shot back. She's done this to other people, men just like you. Don't you see? She's using you. Robert's face darkened, a mix of anger and disbelief flashing in his eyes. That's enough, Elliot. I won't have you disrespecting Vanessa like this. She's been nothing but kind to you. She's pretending, Elliot shouted, his voice cracking. She's going to hurt you, Dad. I'm trying to protect you. But Robert stood, towering over Elliot. Protect me. You're 12 years old, Elliot. You don't know everything, and you certainly don't know Vanessa the way I do. The finality in his tone crushed Elliot. He stared up at his father, tears threatening to spill, but he swallowed them back. You're wrong, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Robert shook his head and walked away, leaving Elliot standing alone in the middle of the room. Later that night, Elliot sat on the edge of his bed, his phone still clutched in his hand. He had failed. His dad didn't believe him, and the wedding was only days away. A soft knock on the door broke his thoughts. Claire stepped in, her expression gentle but concerned. How'd it go? She asked, though the answer was evident on Elliot's face. Tonight. He won't listen, Elliot said, his voice hollow. He thinks I'm just being a kid. Claire sat beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. Elliot looked up at her, his eyes glassy. What do I do, Mom? I can't just let him marry her. Claire hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. Sometimes, people don't want to see the truth, even when it's right in front of them. But that doesn't mean you stop trying. You've done everything you can to warn him. But it's not enough, Elliot said, his voice trembling. He's going to get hurt, and it'll be my fault. Claire's gaze softened. No, it won't. You're brave for standing up for what you believe in, Elliot. That's not something everyone can do. She paused, then added, sometimes the only thing left to do is trust your instincts and take action. Elliot blinked at her. Take action? Like what? Claire sighed, brushing a strand of hair from his face. That's up to you, but whatever you decide, know that I'm proud of you, and I'll always be here for you. As she left the room, Elliot sat in the dim light, his mind racing. His dad might not believe him, but the evidence he'd gathered was undeniable. He thought back to what Claire had said. Do what you think is right. Elliot straightened his back, a spark of determination lighting up his eyes. If his dad wouldn't listen, he'd have to find another way to stop the wedding, and this time, he wouldn't fail. The grand church hummed with quiet anticipation. Stained glass windows filtered the midday sun into a kaleidoscope of colors that danced across the polished pews and vaulted ceilings. The scent of fresh lilies, arranged meticulously along the aisles, mingled with the faint aroma of polished wood. Guests dressed in their finest murmured excitedly, flipping through the ceremony programs adorned with the names Robert and Vanessa. Elliot slouched in the last pew, his heart pounding like a drum. His sharp eyes scanned the crowd, a mix of familiar faces and strangers, all smiling as if this were the happiest day of their lives. Only it wasn't. Not for Elliot. Clutching his phone, he swiped through the folder that held his arsenal of evidence. Vanessa's legal records, screenshots of her aliases, and the audio clip he'd managed to record of her incriminating phone call. It all felt solid, damning even, but in this moment, as the organist began to play the opening chords of Canon in D, doubt slithered into his mind. Doubt? What if no one believed him? What if he ruined the wedding and his dad hated him forever? Elliot shook his head, forcing the thoughts away. His dad deserved to know the truth, and Elliot wasn't about to let fear stop him. The congregation rose, turning their attention to the bride. Vanessa appeared at the church doors, her gown shimmering like moonlight, every detail designed to captivate. Her practiced smile radiated confidence as she began her slow, deliberate walk down the aisle, escorted by her equally glamorous maid of honor. Gasps of admiration rippled through the crowd. Elliot's stomach churned. Everyone was falling for her act, just as his dad had. At the altar, Robert stood waiting, his nervous but genuine smile a stark contrast to Vanessa's polished facade. He looked like a man ready to commit his whole heart. And that broke Elliot's. Gasped. The ceremony began. The officiant welcomed everyone, his warm voice echoing through the vaulted space. Vanessa slipped her arm into Robert's, her smile widening as if she were savoring her triumph. Elliot clenched his fists. The officiant launched into the traditional vows, his voice steady and ceremonial. But as he spoke, Elliot's resolve crystallized. He couldn't sit there and let this happen. Sliding out of the pew as quietly as he could, Elliot moved toward the side aisle. His steps were soft, calculated, but his heart hammered so loudly he was sure someone would hear it. When he reached the midpoint of the aisle, he hesitated, his hand gripping the cool edge of the pew for support. He could still back out, slip away unnoticed. But then his dad's voice rang out as he began to recite his vows, earnest and full of emotion. "Vanessa, you've brought light back into my life." The words were too much. They ignited something in Elliot, a mix of anger, frustration, and the fierce love of a son who couldn't bear to see his father hurt. He straightened his back, stepped forward, and cleared his throat. "Stop." The single word sliced through the serene atmosphere like a thunderclap. All heads turned toward him, eyes wide in shock and confusion. The officiant paused mid-sentence, his mouth slightly open. Vanessa's face froze, her practiced smile faltering for the first time. "Elliot, what are you doing?" Robert's voice was sharp, but there was a flicker of worry behind it. Elliot's palms were slick with sweat, but he held his ground. "Dad, I can't let you go through with this." His voice trembled, but grew stronger with each word. "You don't know who she really is." Gasps rippled through the crowd, and whispers broke out like a low tide. Vanessa's expression darkened, her eyes narrowing into a glare that could pierce steel. "Elliot," Vanessa said, her voice a sugary warning, "this isn't the time for games." "I'm sorry," Elliot said. "It's not a game," Elliot shot back. He pulled his phone from his pocket, holding it up like a shield. "I have proof that you've been lying to him, to all of us. Let's..." Robert stepped forward, his face pale. "Elliot, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about who she really is," Elliot said, his voice gaining strength. He looked out at the guests. "Vanessa isn't who she says she is. She has a history, a trail of lies, fraud, and fake names." Now there is a nation from the audience, and a collective murmur swept through the room. Vanessa's face tightened, the warmth draining from her expression. "This is ridiculous. He's just a kid who's upset about the divorce. He's trying to ruin our day." "Check my phone," Elliot countered, holding it out to Robert. "Everything you need to know is here. Court records, aliases, even a recording of her talking about her plan." "She's using you, Dad." Robert hesitated, torn between the woman he thought he loved and the son who'd never been this bold before. "Robert, don't," Vanessa said, her voice low and urgent. But Elliot's eyes locked onto his dad's, unwavering. "Please, Dad. Just look." "It's over next, my friend." Time seemed to stand still as Robert reached for the phone, his hand shaking slightly. He scrolled through the files, his face growing darker with each swipe. "Vanessa," he said, his voice cracking. "What is this?" "I don't know where he got that," Vanessa stammered, her polished composure finally shattering. "It's fake. He's making it up." "It's not fake," Elliot said, stepping closer. "Everything in there is real. I wouldn't lie to you, Dad. Not about this." Robert's shoulders slumped as he stared at the screen, the weight of betrayal sinking in. Vanessa reached for his arm, but he pulled away. His eyes fell to the screen for a moment. As he raised them, he fixed her with a glare. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The room fell into a deafening silence, every guest holding their breath. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, her mask was completely gone. Elliot watched his dad's face crumble, his heart aching despite the victory. He had stopped the wedding, but the fallout was only beginning. Elliot's legs felt like jelly, but he stood firm as the weight of the moment bore down on him. The church had fallen into a hush so profound that even the faint hum of the organ's pipes seemed to fade into silence. Every eye was locked on him, curious, stunned, judgmental. His hands trembled as he gripped his phone tightly, the screen glowing faintly with the evidence that had kept him awake for nights. "I do," he repeated, louder this time. His voice was uneven but resolute, and the echo of those two words seemed to reverberate off the walls. "Elliot, this is not the time," Robert hissed, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Sit down, right now." Elliot fell silent for a moment, something seemingly terrible occurred. But Elliot didn't move. His eyes darted to Vanessa, who stood frozen at the altar, her perfect posture stiffening like a statue. Her lips pressed together, and for the first time, Elliot saw the cracks in her polished facade. "No, Dad," Elliot said, his voice stronger now. He stepped into the aisle, his sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished wooden floor. "You need to hear this. Everyone does." He turned. Gasps rippled through the room, and the quiet murmur of voices began to rise. A few guests leaned toward each other, whispering in hushed tones. The officiant, visibly uncomfortable, glanced between Robert and Vanessa, unsure whether to intervene. Vanessa finally found her voice. "Elliot, enough," she said, her tone sharp but sugar-coated, as if trying to maintain her image. "You're just upset. This isn't the time to air your grievances." Elliot's glare didn't waver. "This isn't about me being upset. This is about you lying to my dad and everyone else here." Vanessa's jaw clenched, but she managed a brittle smile. "Robert," she said, turning toward him, "he's a child. He doesn't understand what he's doing." Robert's gaze flickered between Vanessa and Elliot, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. "Elliot, I don't know what this is about, but you're ruining everything." Elliot felt the sting of his father's words, but he pressed on. He wasn't doing this for himself, he was doing it for his dad, even if Robert couldn't see it yet. "I'm not ruining anything," Elliot said, his voice growing louder. "I'm trying to save you from making a huge mistake." He raised his phone, the screen now displaying a damning photo of Vanessa's name attached to a fraud case. "I have proof, Dad. She's not who she says she is. She's been lying to you from the start." The room erupted. Guests craned their necks to see the screen, and the once whispered conversations became a low roar of speculation. Vanessa's face drained of color as she stepped toward Elliot, her movements sharp and calculated. "Stop this nonsense," she snapped, her polished demeanor slipping. "You've done enough damage." Elliot took a step back, holding his ground. "You're scared because you know I'm right," he said, his words cutting through the chaos. "You've been conning my dad this whole time, just like you did to all those other people." Robert's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice shaking. "Here," Elliot said, thrusting the phone toward him. Read it. Look at the records. She's been married before. 3 times, Dad. And every single time, she left with a chunk of their money. She's not here for you. She's here for what you have. The room fell silent again, the weight of Elliot's words pressing down on everyone. Robert stared at the phone, his hands trembling as he took it. Vanessa's eyes darted around the room, her confidence faltering. "This is ridiculous," Vanessa said, her voice rising as she tried to laugh it off. "It's fake. He's just a kid making things up because he's jealous or angry or—" "Don't," Elliot interrupted, his voice sharp. "Don't try to spin this. You know it's real." Robert scrolled through the photos and documents on Elliot's phone. His eyes grew wide, his lips parting in disbelief as the truth began to unravel before him. "Vanessa," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "What is this?" Vanessa hesitated for a split second too long. "It's nothing," she said, forcing a strained smile. "Those records are doctored. You can't seriously believe—" "Is it true?" Robert cut her off, his voice louder now, the crack of betrayal evident. The silence that followed was deafening. Vanessa opened her mouth to speak, but found no words. The perfect mask she'd worn since the day she entered their lives crumbled in an instant, revealing the calculating person underneath. Elliot's chest heaved as he watched the realization dawn on his dad's face. It wasn't satisfaction he felt, but a strange mix of relief and heartbreak. This wasn't how he wanted things to go, but it had to be done. "I trusted you," Robert said, his voice trembling. He turned to Vanessa, his eyes filled with hurt. "You said you loved me. Was any of it real?" Vanessa faltered, her polished facade completely gone now. "Robert, Don't," Robert said, holding up a hand. His voice was firm, cutting through the tension like a knife. "I don't want to hear it." The weight of the moment settled over the room as Robert turned to the officiant. "This wedding is over." One by one, the bride and bridesmaids climbed down the aisle. The guests gasped, the realization sinking in. Vanessa stood there, stunned, as if the world had slipped out from under her. Elliot stepped back, his heart heavy but resolute. He had done what he came to do, even if it had cost him something he couldn't yet understand. The church felt like it was suffocating, the air thick with tension. Elliot stood at the front, his phone raised high, projecting the damning photo onto the church's large AV screen. The room, which had once been filled with the soft murmurs of excited guests, now fell into a stunned silence. Vanessa's face, her makeup perfect, her smile too practiced, stared back at them from the mugshot, a stark contrast to the image of the elegant woman she'd tried so hard to portray. Elliot's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders. He barely noticed the sound of his breath, shallow and quick, as he began to speak again, his voice firm but unwavering. "This is who you're marrying, Dad," he said, pointing at the screen. The words seemed to hang in the air, echoing around the cavernous room. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A few of the older guests looked at each other in confusion, while others exchanged whispers, their voices rising with each passing second. It was as though they could no longer process the image that had just been projected. Elliot took a deep breath, his hands slightly shaking as he scrolled through his phone, readying the next piece of the puzzle. He knew what he had to do now. This wasn't just about revealing a single truth. It was about unmasking the whole person Vanessa had been pretending to be. "Vanessa," Elliot continued, his voice carrying through the stunned silence. "She's been involved in more than just a couple of lies." His thumb flicked through the screenshots that had haunted him for days. Each image, each conversation, was more damning than the last. "Vanessa," Elliot continued, his voice clouded with sorrow and worry, Has she finally caught on with things? She's been involved in more than just a couple of lies. She's been involved in more than just a couple of lies. He knew what he was looking at for years. Conning wealthy men, manipulating them with her charm, then taking what she could before disappearing. She's done this before. Multiple times. He began scrolling through her digital paper trail, showing images of text messages and public records that proved Vanessa's fraudulent past. The conversation was carefully crafted, with Vanessa weaving elaborate stories about her business ventures and personal struggles to gain sympathy. But the records told a different story, one of deceit, betrayal, and manipulation. As he read off the names of her former husbands and business partners, Elliot felt his throat tighten. These were people Vanessa had left behind, people who had been burned by her actions, just as he feared his dad would be. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, growing from whispers to horrified gasps. Some guests had their phones out now, recording everything, unable to believe what they were witnessing. Elliot felt the weight of their eyes on him, but he kept his focus on the truth. He needed to finish this, to make sure there was no doubt left in anyone's mind about who Vanessa really was. Vanessa, once so poised and graceful, was now visibly rattled. She stood frozen for a moment, her expression faltering. Her eyes flicked from the screen to Robert, her lips parting as if she could explain it all away. But the facade was gone. Her perfect mask had slipped, revealing the deceit beneath. "I have been counting the number of times I have called you against the office," he said. The velocity-packed words fell away. "This is not real," Vanessa stammered, her voice shaking with an uncharacteristic panic. These are lies. They're all fabrications." She took a step forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Robert, please, don't listen to him. He's just a child trying to ruin everything." Her voice, once so calm and commanding, now quivered with disappointment. "Robert, please, don't listen to him. He's just a child trying to ruin everything." Elliot could see the cracks in her confidence widening with every word. She was unraveling, and there was no way to hide from the truth now. Robert's face was a picture of disbelief, his eyes wide as he looked from the mugshot to the screen, then back to the woman he had once believed was his future. "Vanessa," he said, his voice darkening into something darker. The scar picked out within Robert's voice. "Vanessa," he said, his voice turning into something darker. "Is this true? Tell me this isn't true." For a moment, Vanessa said nothing. Her lips parted as if she were trying to find the words, but no amount of rehearsed charm or smooth talking could undo the damage that had been done. The evidence was inescapable. Her past was being laid bare before an entire congregation. Her perfect image of innocence shattered. No, you don't understand," she pleaded, her voice rising in pitch. "They're just accusations. I've worked so hard to change, Robert. You have to believe me. I'm not that person anymore." She reached for him, her hand trembling slightly, but Robert recoiled, taking a step back as if the very touch of her might burn him. "You lied to me," Robert said, the hurt in his voice palpable. The words hung between them like a heavy weight. "You lied to all of us." His gaze shifted to Elliot, a flicker of understanding beginning to take root. "You were right all along, weren't you?" His voice cracked slightly as he looked back at Vanessa. "I should have listened to you." Elliot stood still, watching his dad wrestle with the betrayal. The room was heavy with silence, save for the low hum of phones capturing every moment of the unraveling scene. Vanessa was no longer the elegant, confident woman who had captured Robert's attention so quickly. She was just a person now, a person whose lies had caught up with her and whose charm had lost its power in the face of the truth. Vanessa's eyes darted around the room, her face flushed with panic, The whispers among the guests had turned into murmurs of outrage. A few people were openly shaking their heads, some with a mixture of pity and disdain, others simply watching in disbelief. There was no place for her to hide anymore. The truth had been exposed, and it was as raw and unforgiving as the light of day. "Please," Vanessa begged, her voice cracking. "I've changed. I'm not the same person. I love you, Robert. But Robert cut her off, his voice firm, a reflection of the man he was now choosing to be. "You don't love me. You love what I can give you. This whole time, that's all it's been, hasn't it?" Vanessa's shoulders sagged as the final curtain fell. There were no more lies to tell, no more manipulations to spin. The truth had finally come to light, and for once, Elliot could breathe easy, knowing that his dad had seen it too. As the truth sank in, Vanessa's composure cracked. Realizing there was no way out, she bolted from the altar, her heels clicking rapidly on the polished church floor. Guests gasped as she sprinted toward the exit, her long white gown trailing behind her like a veil of desperation. Two guests, still in shock but quick to react, fumbled with their phones, capturing the chaotic scene as she fled. The whispers in the church turned into murmurs of disbelief, and the air was thick with confusion. Elliot watched in stunned silence as Vanessa's figure disappeared through the church doors, her escape swift and determined. His heart pounded, knowing that this wasn't over. There were still questions to be answered, and Vanessa wasn't going to make it easy for anyone. But he knew that in the end, the truth would catch up with her. She couldn't outrun the consequences forever. Within minutes, Claire had made the call. The police arrived swiftly, their sirens wailing in the distance. But by the time they reached the church, Vanessa was long gone. The guests, still reeling from the revelations, were left to process what had just happened. The once joyful celebration had now turned into a scene of chaos, with people muttering among themselves, trying to piece together the events that had unfolded in such a short time. Robert stood at the front, his face a pale mask of shock and disbelief. He was frozen, unable to process what had just transpired. His wedding, the culmination of his dreams, had been shattered in an instant. There was no joy, no celebration, only the cold reality of betrayal and shattered trust. His eyes were wide, still glued to the spot where Vanessa had stood moments before, his mind struggling to make sense of everything. Elliot could see the hurt in his father's eyes, but there was no time for comfort now. They would deal with the aftermath later, when the dust had settled. For now, all that mattered was the truth had been exposed, and Vanessa's escape wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of what would come next. The drive home was silent, the tension between father and son palpable. Robert's hands gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white with the weight of everything that had just happened. The quiet hum of the car was the only sound as they made their way back to the house, the once familiar road now feeling like an endless stretch of uncertainty. When they arrived, Robert didn't waste time. He sat down on the couch, his posture defeated, his eyes hollow with regret. Elliot hesitated for a moment before sitting beside him, unsure of what to say. His father's usual confidence was gone, replaced by a broken man grappling with the reality of his choices. "Well, didn't I see it?" Robert's voice was heavy, cracking under the strain of his emotions. He ran a hand through his hair, his gaze distant. "How did I let her fool me for so long?" Elliot's heart softened at the sight of his father's vulnerability. For the first time, Robert wasn't the unshakable figure he had always been. Instead, he was just a man, grappling with a painful truth. Elliot felt a wave of compassion wash over him, but the hurt was still there, a lingering presence in the air. "You wanted to believe in her," Elliot said softly, his voice steady but gentle. It wasn't a reproach, just an understanding of how deeply his dad had wanted this relationship to work. He had wanted to believe in Vanessa because he was searching for something, anything, to fill the emptiness left after the divorce. Therapy had been the way he had tried filling the emptiness since 4 months of leaving home without the way to act on his wounded feelings. But they had left his life behind. Robert looked at his son, his eyes filled with sorrow and gratitude. There was a moment of silence, and then Robert let out a deep, shaky breath. "I should have listened to you, Elliot. I should have trusted you more." His voice faltered, and for the first time he reached out, placing a hand on Elliot's shoulder. Elliot didn't pull away. Instead, he placed his hand on his dad's in return, their shared pain now bridging the distance that had long separated them. The rift created by the divorce, the frustration, the misunderstandings, somehow it all felt smaller now. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to push them closer together, not farther apart. "I don't want to be right about things like this, Dad," Elliot said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I just want you to be okay." Robert nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "We'll get through this. Together." There was a quiet strength in his voice, the kind of resolve that Elliot hadn't heard in a long time. "I promise I'll listen more, and I'll do better by you, son. I'll work on being the dad you deserve." For the first time in a long while, Elliot believed him. They had both been through so much. The hurt, the betrayal, the confusion. But it felt like they were on the brink of something new. This wasn't just about healing from what had happened with Vanessa. It was about rebuilding what had been lost between them. Their relationship, like everything else, would take time to repair. But in that moment, Elliot knew they were finally on the right path. In the days that followed, the fallout from the wedding scandal rippled through the town. Videos of Elliot's dramatic interruption went viral, flooding social media and news outlets. The footage, raw and unfiltered, showed his son standing up for what he believed was right, regardless of the consequences. The scandal became the talk of the town, with people offering mixed opinions. Some admired Elliot's bravery, while others questioned the public humiliation of his father. But the truth was undeniable. Vanessa's facade had been shattered, and the world had seen it for what it was. Plus, despite the chaos, something profound had shifted for Elliot and his dad. The tension between them began to dissolve, slowly but surely. The hurt, though still present, became the catalyst for a new chapter in their relationship. For the first time in years, Robert was truly listening, really listening, to Elliot. "Ready?" They had long avoided open conversations, but now they found themselves talking late into the night, working through their past missteps, and beginning to rebuild the trust they had once lost. Claire, too, found solace in the aftermath. While the events had been difficult, she felt a deep sense of pride in her son. His courage had not only saved his father from making a terrible mistake, but had also brought them closer together. Claire knew that Elliot had always been strong, but now, seeing him fight for what was right, she felt an even deeper admiration for him. She often found herself reflecting on how far they had come as a family, even in the face of such turmoil. The experience had taught them all invaluable lessons. Trust had been broken, but it had also been restored. Resilience had been tested, but it had proven to be unshakable. And above all, they had learned the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it means risking everything. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, and the scars of the past would take time to heal, but they were no longer defined by the events of that fateful day. Instead, they were united by the strength they had found in each other, ready to face whatever came next. It was, in every sense, a new beginning.